Hello students, this is the recording for lesson 2.22 and we'll be talking about ATP. Here's a general overview of what we'll be going over today. We'll be going over what ATP is and how ATP provides energy, specifically chemical energy, to drive chemical reactions inside of a cell. The goals for this lesson is that you'll understand that the energy stored in the ATP bonds is the most common source of energy for life processes. You'll also be able to recognize how ATP stores energy and releases that energy. You'll be able to understand how the structure of ATP contributes to its job or function in storing and providing energy. And lastly, you'll be able to recognize some of the cellular processes that require ATP. So let's take a look at ATP. ATP is a molecule that stores and provides energy for all of life's processes. So previously in the unit, we talked about the 7 characteristics of living things: cellular organization, metabolism, homeostasis, reproduction, growth and development, response, and heredity. All of these characteristics require ATP on some level. The chemical energy that powers all of these processes is in the molecule adenosine triphosphate, which we call ATP. ATP is made or produced during the cellular pathways that break down the molecule glucose. So we have glucose as an energy source, and when we break down glucose, we can make ATP, which is a usable form of energy for all living things. ATP, if we look at its structure, we'll see that it's made of other chemical components. So if you read its name carefully, you might see some familiar words, like for example, phosphate. We talked about phosphate when we talked about nucleic acids, and the fact that it's a triphosphate means that there must be 3 phosphate groups. Another word that you might be familiar with is adenosine. It kind of sounds like adenine. And adenine, which was the nitrogenous base in nucleic acids, is found in ATP as well. The last component is the sugar ribose. The sugar ribose is also present in ATP. So adenine plus the sugar ribose together we'll call adenosine, and then we have those additional phosphate groups, those 3 additional phosphate groups that make up the entire structure of ATP. So here you see 3 phosphate groups, 1, 2, 3. We see an adenine, which is right here, and a ribose that is right here. The energy of ATP is stored in the chemical bonds in its phosphate tail. So remember when we looked at ATP, we had 3 phosphates, right? We had a sugar, and then we also had the base, which was adenine. Okay, so energy is actually stored within these phosphate bonds, so the bonds that are found in between the phosphate groups. So the triphosphate tail of an ATP molecule is its energy storehouse. So we store it inside of these bonds. The only way to release that stored energy is to actually break those bonds. So to release energy, ATP is broken down, and it's not broken down entirely. It's broken down from the tip of its tail, so at the end of its phosphate tail, by removing 1 phosphate group. And in that case, we're breaking the bond and releasing the energy. This reaction is called hydrolysis. Hydrolysis of ATP produces 1 free phosphate group, and that produces, if we get rid of this phosphate group here, adenosine diphosphate, which we call ADP. Remember, di means 2, so instead of triphosphate, we now have diphosphate. That reaction, when we release that 1 phosphate group, right? That one phosphate group, and it leaves, it releases a lot of energy that can drive many chemical reactions within a cell. Cells can also make ATP from ADP by using energy to reconnect the phosphate group. So you can release it to release energy, and you can put it back, but that requires energy as well. So in this way, ATP can be regenerated for use again by a cell. So it can go from ATP to ADP back to ATP. Additional reactions can actually further break down ADP, which remember has 2 phosphates, by removing another phosphate group and producing adenosine monophosphate, which is 1 phosphate group. And AMP can be an important molecule because it plays a role in intercellular communication and movement in the cell. Okay, so if we want to take a look at how exactly ATP drives cellular reaction and processes, we could take a look at these 3 pictures here. So let's look at the first picture. What you see is an enzyme, and this enzyme has a substrate. And the substrate is going to bind onto the active site. We also have a place on the enzyme for ATP. So the ATP will then bind onto its specific spot on the enzyme. Once it binds, we see that this bond right here is broken. So we see the bond is broken and the phosphate falls off. What you see right here is energy that is being released. And what does the energy do? It's going to form a bond between these 2 substrates, so that in the end, what you see is the substrate falls off and we now have a new product. This new product would not be able to be formed if it weren't for the energy that was released when that phosphate group was broken off. So where does ATP production occur? It occurs in the mitochondria. So cells use and produce ATP. And how exactly and where exactly does that happen? The sun shines down and a plant makes glucose. Then the energy in the bonds of glucose is transferred to the bonds of an ATP molecule. So again, remember we have a transfer in energy from glucose to ATP, and that's called cellular respiration. So ATP is produced as an end result of breaking down the glucose molecule, which occurs in cellular respiration. So ATP may be the motor of the cell, where it provides a lot of the energy, but there appear to be no organisms on Earth that make ATP directly. ATP has to be made from the energy that was originally in glucose molecules. You can't make ATP directly. But even the first step in breaking down glucose requires ATP. So ultimately, the breakdown of glucose produces more energy in the form of ATP than it requires. So even though you do need some ATP molecules to break down glucose, in the end, by breaking down glucose, you make even more ATP than you actually use. All that ATP is used to drive the activities of the cell and must be constantly produced. It's not just produced sometimes, but continuously throughout the day. ATP is essential for life. ATP is required for all life processes. Cells use ATP to move molecules, ions, and other substances across their cell membranes. Some substances can flow freely across the cell's phospholipid bilayer, but many times energy is required to bring substances in, and this is what we call active transport. So in order to bring important things inside of the cell so the cell can maintain that homeostasis, we do need ATP. So cells use ATP for thousands of things. A breakdown in the ATP production, so if we're not able to make ATP, that will actually kill a cell because a cell cannot survive without ATP. So I'm sure you guys have heard of the poison cyanide. What cyanide does is it works to shut down the cellular processes that make ATP. So when you're exposed to cyanide, you're no longer able to make ATP, and thus your cells will eventually die, and eventually the organism will die as well. ATP has a huge role when it comes to how muscles function. They power muscles in the body. So whether you're just climbing into bed for a good night's sleep or getting ready for a 5K run, ATP is really that primary source of energy that you use in order to move your muscles. And ATP provides the energy required for your muscles to contract. So again, ATP is used for muscle contraction. So it's impossible to make all the ATP you need and even sustain yourself for even a couple seconds. It's important that ATP is constantly produced in muscle cells as they perform work. You can't just store it up and use it and then make some more 2 days later. You have to continuously make it. That's how important it is to have ATP. The process of cellular respiration. Remember, cellular respiration is glucose being broken down in order to form ATP, which is that usable energy, provides the ATP for your muscles. And we'll be learning more about that in the next unit. So a summary of this lesson is that ATP provides chemical energy that's usable in all organisms to drive chemical reactions for the cell. The molecule ATP contains energy in its chemical bonds. Remember, it occurs, the energy is stored in between the phosphate bonds, so when you break those phosphate bonds, the energy is released. When ATP breaks down, it breaks down into ADP, but it can actually be built back up to ATP so that ATP can actually be recycled in our body over and over again. So the one important vocabulary word that you need to know is adenosine triphosphate, which is ATP, and that's the molecule we talked about today that delivers usable chemical energy for almost all processes and reactions that a cell must undergo to survive.